You're listening to the Belly Dance Geek Clubhouse at bellydancegeek.com.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining me. My name is Nadira Jamal, and welcome to the Belly Dance Geek Clubhouse. The Clubhouse is a place where dancers can get together and geek out on all of that stuff that's hard to get in classes and on DVDs. It's really easy to find information about the what, so things like moves and combos and choreographies, but it's a lot harder to get info on the why, so things like musicality and culture and professionalism, and things like the how, composition and stagecraft. So every month I'm going to interview a different guest expert on a different geeky topic, and we'll always have time for question and answer so you can geek out too. So if you think that knowledge and creativity go together like chocolate and peanut butter, you are in the right place.
Ooh,
So my guest today is Morocco, and she has 53 plus years researching, assimilating, performing, lecturing, teaching classes and master seminars internationally, including in Egypt, Morocco, and Turkey, in Near and Middle Eastern and North African dance. These are things that she learned in culture here and over there. Morocco has received numerous awards and accolades in her field, and an interview with her is in the Lincoln Center Dance Collection's Oral History Archives. Nominated as one of America's 100 Dance Treasures, her recently published reference book is in its fourth printing. It's already published in German in 2013 and is coming out in Chinese in Shanghai in July of 2014. Morocco organized, directed, and choreographed for Morocco and the Casbah Dance Experience. She performed and lectured regularly in New York City's Museum of Natural History from 1970 to 1998. Her articles have been published internationally since 1965. She's been both a presenter and subject of other people's papers at CORD, ICHPERSD UNESCO, CID, and SDHS conferences. She's filmed and produced 6 research videos/DVDs that won the Giza Award. Morocco also invented tours over there to Morocco, Egypt, and Turkey from 1976 onward, geared for Middle Eastern dancers so they could see the real thing that she's been haranguing them about. And today, Rocky's going to talk to us about the early days of Oriental dance in New York City. Now, you'll notice that I use the term Oriental dance, even though the name of this show is the Belly Dance Geek Clubhouse. And in her book, You Ask Aunt Rocky, Morocco makes a really good case for why we need to be using the O word rather than the B word. So out of respect, I'm going to continue using that term for the rest of this episode.
Thank you.
So welcome, Morocco.
Thank you, sweetheart. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for coming. So let's just jump right in. I'm really excited about talking to someone with so much experience and so much perspective on the dance from such a great career. So why don't we start at the very beginning? So tell us about how you got started in Oriental dance.
Oh, that was a riot and a half. I was a concert flamenco dancer, and I was working with the Ballet Español Jiménez Vargas, which was a really fine company out of Spain. But the problem was in that era, the unions were not as strong as they became later, and we weren't getting paid for rehearsal. So I was getting kind of skinny. And a friend of mine who owned the rehearsal studio where the company rehearsed was a Greek Orthodox priest. And he said, I have a friend who's opening a new nightclub, and she needs dancers. I'm sending you. You tell her I sent you, and you'll get in. It should be really easy because Lord knows you work all day at this. I'll just tell her I sent you, and let's see what happens. So I get my guitarist, who was Sabikis' brother. His name was Diego Castellon, and we went to this restaurant, which was on the corner of 29th Street and 8th Avenue in Manhattan. And there was a woman there who says, who is this with you? Is this your husband? I said, no. Your manager? No, he's my guitarist. So, oh, we have a guitarist. Now, I'm thinking in terms of dance, of flamenco dance. So I ask her, does he know all the rhythms? Oh, yes, he plays for dancer all the time. He knows all the rhythms. Everything you want, he can play. If I change tempo, will he change tempo? I tell you, he work with dancer all the time. If you want, he play. I said, okay. And Diego said, well, I didn't want a job anyway. I'm too busy with my club gigs. And I go inside, and she says, okay, go put on uniform. Show me what you do. So I go downstairs, and I put on a dress that's called the bata de cola. It's a long ruffled dress with a long train that you kick around while you're dancing. And I come upstairs, and she says, "What's this?" Now, I'm looking around, and there's no stage. It's just a flat floor with tables. So I'm thinking, well, maybe the dance floor is amongst the tables, and they don't want a bata because who wants people kicking dust in the patrons' food? So I said, okay, I have the riding habit, the traje de montar, and I have the dress with the polka dots and the fringe. She says, honey, we don't want Spanish dancer. We want Oriental dancer, ballet dancer. I said, well, I don't do ballet, but I do escuela bolera, which is Spanish ballet with castanets. I said, no, honey, I didn't say ballet. I said belly dancer, Oriental dance, Oriental dance. And I said, I don't do any Japanese or Chinese dance. So she says to me, sit, you look. Maybe you think you don't know, but you know. Sit, you watch. And she sends this other person on to audition. The poor puppy, first of all, was built like a Christmas tree. Secondly, and this was the bad part, she looked like Richard Nixon. 5 o'clock shadow and all. Now, I could have lived with that because I'm no gorgeous creature myself. But this kid couldn't hold a rhythm if you put it in a paper bag and handed it to her. So I said, having more guts than brains, oh, please, if I can't do better than that, I'll hand in my feet. So one of the other women who was there to audition said, oh, yeah, Big Mouth, I'll lend you a costume. Let's see what you can do. So she lends me this outfit that I'd never seen anything like it before. And I was A, 53 years younger, and B, 55 pounds lighter. And I tried to get into the costume, and the bra, I needed 2 rolls of toilet paper and my socks to close the credibility gap. I had the belt on backwards, but I figure, what the hell, Archie? No pain, no reward. So I go up, and they're playing this rather interesting music, and I do a sort of samba mora to it, and the woman says, you're not Oriental dancer, but you're dancer. You look good. Plus, Father Avlonitis, he only sends me good people. I give you the job 2 weeks. You look, you learn, you stay. You look, you no learn, thank you very much, goodbye. Now, I have to explain that in that day, in a 3-block radius on 8th Avenue in Manhattan, there were like 13 Greek and Turkish clubs. And this one was going to be called the Arabian Nights. It was going to feature Arabic music and musicians. And the woman who owned it, Mariantha Stevens, was half Lebanese and half Greek. And I'd never seen anything like this before in my life, but there were these restaurants that all had at least 3 dancers working every night. They'd work 6 nights a week, and then there'd be a 4th dancer who would work on one of the nights that the other 3 weren't working. So 13 times 4, you've got 52 dancers in a city that maybe had 10 to 12 people who could really say they were like authentic or knew what they were doing. And I'm fond of saying that at that point, if Godzilla had a costume, she could have gotten a 6-night-a-week gig. That's how desperate they were. And they hired me because that's how desperate they were. Yes, I was a dancer, but I knew nothing about Oriental dance. However, the music, when I heard it, I was a flamenco dancer because I had fallen in love with the music. And the Middle Eastern music spoke even deeper to me. And I was extremely lucky because in that particular club, because she was going for Arabic music, she had hired a qanun player named Mohammed Al-Akkad, who had just come over from Cairo after playing for years for Kulthum. And before him, his father had played for her. And there was a Jordanian oud player named Joe Badawi, who was he was Syrian. It was a Syrian oud player, Joe Badawi, who was a sweetheart and a fabulous musician. And then there was a Turkish clarinetist and a couple of Greek musicians. And there was a Lebanese singer, a Greek singer, a female Greek singer, a female Turkish singer, and there were a couple of Greek musicians who also sang. And what happened in New York at that point, because of the cabaret laws, if you were female and working in some restaurants that sold booze, you had to have a cabaret permit, a cabaret license, in order to be allowed to work there. You were fingerprinted and photographed, and if you had even ever been convicted of a misdemeanor, you couldn't get a cabaret license. You couldn't work in a nightclub in New York City. In fact, like Frank Sinatra, because he had been convicted of some kind of small misdemeanor when he was a young guy, he couldn't work in a nightclub in New York until the Copacabana, with all their quote-unquote family money, took that case to the state Supreme Court and won it. But in the 60s, the 70s, you still needed a cabaret license in order to work in one of those nightclubs. And if you were female, you were not allowed to, unless you were a waitress, a hat check girl, a cigarette girl, somebody who was dealing directly with the public, you were not allowed to talk with the customers or sit with the customers. If your own personal mother came in, you couldn't sit at the same table with her, or the place could lose its liquor license, which was great protection for us ladies, because what happened was, in between our performance sets, we sat on the stage with the musicians and the other dancers. And another reason for this was that there were several different ethnic persuasions in that neighborhood, and some of them were illiterate in their own language, let alone somebody else's. And there was no way to effectively advertise in all the languages they would have to in the windows there, so that for the clientele that was Greek and Turkish and Armenian and Albanian and Egyptian and Palestinian, and so were lots of Lebanese and Syrians, they couldn't put up signs in all those languages. What they would have was big picture windows out front, and the performers would be sitting on the stage all the way at the back of the room, so that people who passed by could look inside and see who was performing there, who was on for that night. And that saved them the necessity of having to put up signs in like 10 different languages and different alphabets. They could see if there was somebody that they wanted to see, a singer they liked, or a dancer they liked, or a musician they liked, and they would come in and patronize the place if they saw who it was that they liked out there. So we were kind of, in a way, a living ad for the space inside. And they were also too cheap to hire and pay for drummers, so we played drum for each other. Now, most of the other dancers bitched and moaned about it because it was additional work, and it's not easy banging on a drum all night. But I took it as a great opportunity to learn the rhythms, which I did. I had a grand old time. I hogged the drum. I was bouncing around in my seat, banging on the drum. And if you played something wrong, the musicians and the other dancers let you know immediately. So it was a fabulous school right there. What I was told, I didn't see this personally because I came at a time after these things had happened. In the 50s, because I got this job the last week in December of 1960. They wanted to open for New Year's, and they needed to have enough dancers on hand so that they could open for New Year's with a full complement of performers. And I was told that in the 50s, the dancers in the New York Greek clubs didn't wear costumes. They wore, fancy formal dresses, and they would sing and then dance during the intervals in the song, so that they weren't in what we consider the quote unquote traditional costume, even though it isn't really all that traditional. But they were wearing like cocktail dresses and dancing around during the chorus of the songs that they would sing. So they also had to be able to sing as well as dance.
Mm-hmm.
However, in Boston and Chicago and a few other places, the dancers wore costumes, and those places did better business than the places where they didn't wear costumes. So the club owners in New York kind of caught on that it would behoove them to have the dancers wear costumes. And they started wearing costumes not too long before I started dancing in the clubs.
Gotcha. You know, I think I remember seeing a movie clip from a Greek movie of a lady in a slightly see-through dress who sang and then got around and danced. And it was clearly not a costume, but it was a singer's costume.
Yeah. And what had happened, and one of the reasons that the clubs were doing so well at the point when I ended up in them, the movie Never on Sunday had come out and was very popular in the States. It was a huge hit in the States. And Americans, through that movie, found out about Bazookia, and they wanted more of it because the movie to them was fascinating. So they started coming to the section of New York that was called Greektown, and they wanted to see what they had seen in the movies. But the main clientele in these restaurants were the people to whom this music and these dances belonged.
Mm-hmm.
It was their music and their dances, and what happened was here they found themselves in America where they had come. At that point, it was mostly economics. They wanted a better life for themselves and their families, but they missed their music, they missed their food, they missed their dances. And people who would have never gone to a restaurant or a nightclub in their own countries of origin found themselves going regularly to these places because they were homesick.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted their music, they wanted their food, they wanted their dances, and the whole families would come in. Everyone from the grandparents and the great-grandparents down to the little baby in the basket. And it was rather fascinating because it was the older people who were up and dancing most enthusiastically, whereas some of the younger people looked like their parents had dragged them there and they didn't want to be there, which was true. The younger people were busy trying to be American, and their parents were trying to turn them into some old country paragon of what they wanted. It was, I think, something that's played out with just about every immigrant population in every country, everywhere, where the parents they miss their home, they're homesick, they want their music, they want their dances, and the kids, they can't become American fast enough to suit themselves. So there's that good old age-old conflict going on.
Exactly. Now, when I got serious about dance, one of the things that my teacher really emphasized was that one of the big things that makes Oriental dance different from things like ballet is that the audience has a huge effect on the show. So, we've talked about some of the different groups that were there in New York. So how did the audience affect the show at that time? If you had a bigger table of Greeks, did that change what you did?
They would gear what they sang to who was there. Plus, there was what the Greeks called paragelia, which was from the Turkish paragelior, meaning the money is coming. Patrons would make requests for a specific song, or a specific folk dance, and the musicians and the singers would comply with that request. They were being paid to play that song. And the whole family would get up and dance. And it was also the first time I had ever seen men dance alone. I mean, the second or third night I'm there, I think it was the second night I was there, they're playing this really heavy rhythm that I found fascinating. It was kind of uneven. It was dum da da dum da dum da da dum da da dum da da dum da. And I remember it because I had to play drum to it.
On your second day.
Yeah, and the new kid gets to do all the dirty work. They thought it was a big joke, except that I got it. I could hear it because I can hear rhythm. But there's this guy, and he looks like he's drunk out of his gourd. His arms are weaving around. He's jumping and hitting his feet, and he's crouching down, and he's doing all these strange things, and I'm wondering what's going on here. And then another guy gets up, and I have to tell you, these were kind of like small boned, high cheekbones, mustaches. To me, they look Latin. I thought these were Puerto Rican guys. What do I know? Okay, so this other guy gets up, and he's doing something similar, except they start moving like they're about to have a fight. And I turned to one of the singers, and I said, why don't they make them sit down? They're going to kill each other. And she looks at me and says, you crazy, Mori? It's Greek folk dance, the Zembekiko. What do I know? I never saw two guys dance either alone or together like that in like an American dance place. And like in flamenco, when a guy gets up and dances alone, he's performing, and that's something that I knew, but I'd never seen anything like this before. And what I also found fascinating was that the best dancers were the little kids and the grannies. And after a while, I realized it was because the teenage girls and the young women had to appear proper. They couldn't just get up and boogie their butts off. They had to be proper, or they'd be in deep trouble with their families. But again, these were the kids that wanted to be American and wanted to get out of there. And because we couldn't dance with the customers or sit and talk to them, when I saw somebody do a movement or a step I wanted to learn or I wanted to know more about, I'd wait until she had to go to the ladies' room, and then I'd run downstairs to the ladies' room and trap her in there and ask her to show me what it was that she did, because it was a substantial-sized ladies' room. It was a three-seater, plus sinks. And they thought I was cute. And they also noticed I didn't smoke, I didn't drink, I didn't seem to talk to men. So they thought I was a good girl. I looked like them. I wanted to hear their stories. I wanted to learn their dances. Their own kids didn't want to. So they took me home and they made me an honorary daughter. I learned a lot of this stuff in their living rooms and their kitchens because we couldn't get up and dance together in the clubs when they came in. So I kind of learned the way they learned in culture. We'd like dance around the kitchen, dance around the living room. And they saw, because as far as they were concerned, I was a good girl, but because I wasn't really like generic Arabic or Turkish, it was okay for me to talk to the men too. They were kind of like substitute uncles and substitute grandpas. If I were from the family and it was a man who wasn't in the family, I couldn't really just have a casual conversation with him because that wouldn't be proper. But because I was an honorary member, I was privileged in a way that sometimes people from within the culture aren't.
Gotcha.
And that's pretty much how I learned, a bit at a time. And thank God they didn't have videotape back then, because I'd hate to see any kind of reproduction of what I was doing. Each show was a new experiment.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked about nightclubs a little bit, and when I started dancing, nightclub style and cabaret style gave me completely the wrong impression, because, for me, the idea of going clubbing or going to a nightclub, is kind of like the show Jersey Shore, right? It's you go, you get drunk, you might go home with somebody, right? And that's not at all what we're talking about here. So
no, and it wasn't what it was like when I was a teenager. when we went to clubs, now remember, I'm no spring chicken here. I'm going to be 74 March 2nd. And so I was a teenager in the 50s. And when we went, quote unquote, clubbing, it was to either go ballroom dancing or to see a floor show. They still had floor shows then, and big ones. Places like Lou Walters. Oh Lord, I'm blanking on the name. I'm having a senior moment here, folks. It wasn't the Copacabana. Lou Walters, Barbara Walters' father, had a big nightclub on Broadway in Manhattan, and one of the requirements in his club was that the women wear pasties. So I was never going to work in Lou Walters' club, that's for sure, because that was not going to happen. But going clubbing when I was a teenager meant going to see a floor show, getting dressed up, and in fact, in some places they actually wore evening gowns to go out. They got that dressed up. Because that's what you see in some of the old movies where they're wearing those lovely satin gowns. It was that kind of a very special event, going out to a nightclub or a restaurant to see a floor show. It wasn't in the sense it later became after the twist came out and discos started and young people started going to nightclubs to meet the other young people. And actually, that's when they started becoming like singles bars. I lived on East 70th between First and York in Manhattan in the early 60s when TGI Fridays was just a neighborhood bar. And then all of a sudden, the whole singles scene started, and a whole other phenomenon was born. And that was the beginning of that, and that was in like the mid-60s, the early mid-60s.
Gotcha. So it sounds like, when we think about the old restaurants, we're really talking more supper club, dinner and a show,
yes,
rather than show up, eat your food, and leave, or go out to a bar and dance and maybe get drunk.
Yes. Of course, some of the patrons got drunk because they were serving alcohol, but usually the main motivation wasn't to, go out and get soused. It was to go out and dance with your relatives and friends and have a grand old time, which most of them managed to do.
Yeah. So looking at, the scene at that time, was the music similar to the kinds of things that we hear in clubs and restaurants today, or was it different?
Well, it wasn't. This was the time, the first club that I worked in, the Arabian Nights, they had just discovered amplifiers that had reverbs on them. I have serious hearing loss because I was sitting in the band with those amplifiers with the reverbs on them. It was a battle of the loudspeakers on more than one occasion, and that could be pretty painful. But a lot of the songs were the same ones that you still hear because they're the traditional songs. So that would be what they were playing. And that
did
was
most places... Sorry, go ahead.
That was what the people who came to those restaurants came for, their traditional music. That was one of the things they missed. The musicians usually also had day jobs, so they'd be working all day, and then they'd come out at night and play until 4 a.m. because they loved the music they were playing too. It was truly, in a lot of instances, a labor of love. In some instances it wasn't, but in a lot of instances it was. and that was amazing. It was a thrill to work with these guys because when they saw that you were interested in knowing what was going on, they practically turned themselves inside out to help you learn. At least they did with me. I know there were other people that have different memories of the same era because they didn't have as good an experience as I did. I was very lucky. I was very, very lucky in the circumstances, and I pretty much realized that back then, but the more I see and the more I hear of other people's experiences, the more I realize how thoroughly fortunate and blessed I was.
Mm-hmm. Now, when we think about the music in the clubs, one sad trend that I'm seeing is that a lot fewer places are having live music these days. And even the ones that are tending to move more towards smaller and smaller groups.
Yeah.
How big were the ensembles often? I know that you mentioned that they were sometimes too cheap to get a drummer.
Yeah, but there was usually an oud player.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of the clubs also had qanun players, either Turkish or Arabic, mm-hmm. and always a clarinetist, a bouzouki player, because it was mostly a Greek area in the city, and guitarist, a regular guitarist who played background. They didn't have trap drums, and the singers would play tambourines while they sang. They'd bang on a tambourine while they sang. So there
That's
was
like
that.
6, 7, 8 people right there.
Yeah.
I think the best I've ever gotten was 5, and even that was pretty great.
Yeah, well, it was, things were cheaper then as far as what music cost, but there was a lot more discretionary money around then than there is now. One of the big blows to the scene was the oil embargo in 72, 73, when there's a long political story behind it, but the bottom line is the oil company saw they could start gouging for gas, and while there were barges loaded with oil in the Hudson River, there were people online at gas stations shooting each other because they couldn't get gas for their tanks so they could get to work. And the prices on everything increased and over doubled almost overnight because of it, because everything, one way or another, depends on energy and the cost of it. And at that point, if people didn't have enough gas to get to work, they weren't going to be getting in the car and going to some nice little Middle Eastern mom-and-pop restaurant that's open on weekends and features a live band and dancers. And also then, music was live because we didn't have easy portable music. The tape recorders were reel-to-reel. The smallest one was a woolen sack that weighed 58 pounds. Who's going to carry that around? And the Mafia and the Musicians Union were a lot stronger then, so that if you wanted to have a place and not have it firebombed, you hired live musicians, preferably union members. Although when they left the ethnic clubs alone because they couldn't talk to them. They didn't speak Greek, Turkish, and Arabic, so they couldn't intimidate them into joining a union and paying dues when they couldn't understand them.
Gotcha. Now, you've mentioned unions a couple of times already. Can you tell us about that? Because that's not something I'm aware of in my area, being very active in the last, 20, 30 years.
What, a union? There is no union in the Middle Eastern dance scene that I know of, but in the regular nightclubs and regular musicians, you had to be a member of the musicians local in your area. And, of course, Broadway shows, the musicians are union. There's a very strong, actually, union for Broadway shows to the point where, until recently, pit bands were a lot bigger than they needed to be because of the union and the union requirements. In some ways, this works for the show, and in some ways it works against it, where it seriously raises the cost of any kind of Broadway production. But I'm pro-union, and at that one point, actually, I was a member of the American Guild of Variety Artists, Screen Actors Guild, American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, Actors Equity, because I did work that was covered within those venues.
And were many dancers involved in unions at all, or was it mostly the musicians?
No, not Oriental dancers. It was because I also worked, as a concert flamenco dancer. That was the American Guild of Musical Artists. Now, American Guild of Variety Artists no longer exists because vaudeville is gone. But they mainly covered nightclubs, and the Latin Quarter was the name of the club that Lou Walters owned. It was called the Latin Quarter. But where was I?
We were talking unions.
Yeah. As I said, the American Guild of Variety Artists mainly covered the nightclubs that had shows and vaudeville and theaters that had revolving shows, and you had to be a member of the union in order to be able to work in those clubs. They had a lock on it.
Gotcha. So that leads me to another question, which is, what was it like to be a working dancer in this heyday period when you could have a job 6 nights a week?
It was fabulous. I'm not going to lie. I loved it. All I did all night was either play music, listen to music, or dance. You can't beat that with a stick.
And how is the pay compared to now?
In proportion to the economy, it was much better than it is now. At that point, subway fare was, I think, a dime, and a can of tuna was like 16 cents. A loaf of bread was 16 cents. Try and get it for that now. So that, as I said, in proportion to the economy, we were doing okay. And also because dancers got together and new dancers were told, don't you dare accept money below X or below Y, or you'll be in a lot of trouble with us because you'll be undercutting. And we listened. If they said, you've got to charge at least X amount, we charged at least X amount, and we got it. And at that point in history, that X amount was enough money to live on.
In New York City.
In New York City. But at that point in New York City, I had a 3-room apartment for $40 a month. Try and find that now. Unless it's a science fiction program, it ain't going to happen.
And what were the working conditions like?
Well, as far as I was concerned, they were pretty good because I liked what I was doing. I mean, I loved what I was doing. You worked in most places, from 9:30 to 4 in the morning. The Egyptian Gardens didn't start until 10 o'clock, so the Egyptian Gardens was 10 until 4 in the morning. And on Saturday, because of the liquor laws and the blue laws then, if you have an hour less to drink, all of a sudden you're going to go to church, oh sure. On Saturday, they could only stay open until 3 in the morning. And we were glad because in Chicago, they stayed open a lot later, and the conditions were not as good as they were in New York because of the cabaret laws. I liked those cabaret laws. It pretty much protected the women who worked in the clubs from a lot of pressure to drink with or mingle with customers. And one of the reasons for the cabaret laws was that there had been nightclubs on 52nd Street, jazz clubs and strip clubs that made the women who worked in them drink with the customers and sometimes sell themselves to the customers. So these cabaret laws were a reaction against that. But my personal theory as to why that happened was, I think maybe some person with influence was robbed or worse by somebody in one of those clubs and finally decided to do something about it. Because, nothing gets cracked down on until somebody with power or influence is upset. And I think that may be why the cabaret laws started.
Gotcha. And, were the club owners generally respectful? I know in some places and sometimes they've been manipulative and trying to pit dancers against each other, and in other places you do get that family atmosphere that you've been talking about where they kind of take you under their wing and, their wives, sit with you and whatnot.
It depended on the club, on the particular owner, and what the dancer would or wouldn't, or the singers or musicians allowed them to get away with. If a club owner tried to take advantage, we told each other. There was a dancer grapevine, and we told each other, watch out for this guy, watch out for that guy. Don't, make sure when you go into the dressing room you plug the holes that he bored in the wall. That kind of thing.
Blech.
And there was actually only one club like that on 8th Avenue, and the owner was known to be a slime ball. And so most of us stayed well away from that particular club. He also didn't pay as well as the other places. And when you started out, you got less. As you got better or as you got more assertive, you could negotiate more money. And it was a very emotional climate in a lot of ways, in that if you politely asked for something, you didn't usually get it. You had to do a whole, prima donna fit to be heard because it's a loud culture and they are very emotional and expressive. And so you also had to be emotional and expressive if you were going to get what you wanted or what you needed. So you'd have these little drama episodes. It was fun.
Now, I'm thinking back to the story of how you got started.
Yeah.
And, when I was reading your book and reading your story, I was thinking about how different it was from the way that I got started. So it seems like most people these days, take classes for whatever number of years, and then sometimes we do student nights, and then we get into the big leagues. But, apparently actual dance classes are a pretty recent development for us. So how did most dancers get started?
Well, actually, there were very few who were performing who had been performers, quote unquote, over there. However, some of them were what we call reelies, who found out they could make some money doing what they did at Cousin Amina's wedding in a nightclub, but they would never do something like that at home because they'd be in deep doo-doo if they did. It wasn't something that good girls did. But over here where nobody knew and nobody saw, and they could get away with it. But there were also a lot of people who, as I say in my book, wouldn't know Bellady from Bumblebee, who were faking it, and very well, because there was so little knowledge about the dance and so much misinformation about it that you could come up with pretty much any kind of Hollywood fantasy steer stool and get away with it. So that if somebody had a fantasy idea and like you're going to be like some harem hottie or what we call belly bunnies, they could get away with it and get jobs with it because there was the cliche misinterpretation and there were venues for it. Not in the ethnic clubs. The ethnic clubs wanted to see something that at least approximated what they saw back home. But there were enough American venues where you could get away with BS and get paid better in the American venues than in the Middle Eastern venues because it was considered more exotic then. It's become not mainstream, but sort of mainstream, so that there's more knowledge about what the dance is supposed to be like. There's more knowledge about what is good or not good. As I said before, and I wasn't kidding, if Godzilla had a costume, she could have gotten a 6-night-a-week gig. Now, what was considered a consummate professional then would probably be considered a beginner now. Classes didn't start until the mid-'60s. I taught individuals just for my own fun and enjoyment pretty much almost as soon as I started because there were still a lot of jobs available, and the best way to learn something well is to teach it to somebody else. When you're forced to analyze it and break it down for somebody else, it helps you learn it better, or at least that's what I think. And so there'd be friends that had seen me dance and wanted to know how to do it because it looked like fun, and it was. So I taught them and actually got them jobs because you could then. The median level of skill now is far, far higher than it was then. Gotcha. And that's a wonderful thing.
Definitely. And so, in this, let's say, first generation and a half of performers, were these mostly Americans or Middle Easterners who had moved here, or their children, their grandkids?
Some of them were American, and some of them were what we called the realies. And it was a coin toss as to what you would encounter when you went somewhere, whether the dancer was from there or not. And rather fascinatingly, some of the worst dancers were a couple of the realies. There goes the myth about being born over there. Ain't necessarily so. Some of them were great. Some of them were absolutely great. And some of them didn't start out being dancers, like Mine Jushkun was a very famous singer in Turkey. And she and her sister were very well-known and very well-respected and actually loved in Turkey. But when the sister married an American serviceman and stopped singing, and so Mine was left pretty much on her own, and she gets an offer of work in America. So she accepts the job, and she comes to America to work at the Egyptian Gardens. And after she sang her first set, and everyone was ecstatic because she's a fabulous singer and a beautiful woman, they said, "Okay, now you put on uniform, make dance." "What do you mean, make dance?" "I don't dance, I'm a singer." "Oh, no, here, everybody dance. You put on uniform, make dance." Well, she fought it for a while, but the money was too good in proportion to the economy then. So she started dancing, and she was really good. She did the best heavy ciftatelli of anyone I have ever seen, bar none. But she wouldn't play finger cymbals when she worked at the Egyptian Gardens, because that would mean that then she was a real professional dancer. She insisted that she would never play finger cymbals, but when she came to work at the Round Table for like 4 weeks, she played finger cymbals because that was a requirement of the job there. And
so it was more of I'm a singer, but I'll do a little dance set here and there.
Yeah, but she was really, really good. And there were a few really fine dancers working in those clubs. And then there was one actually Turkish dancer who auditioned at the Egyptian Gardens, and she was so bad and so vulgar that the oud player put his oud down and walked off the stage. Yeah, so much for it being in the blood. The good news is she didn't get a job there. She got an awful lot of offers to go out and have dinner but she didn't get a job dancing there. But not everybody could dance well. And when I think back of what I got away with, I wouldn't have hired me. But somebody did, and because they did, hey, who knew? I'm fond of saying that God's got a real weird sense of humor, that real life is what happens while you're busy making other plans.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even know this dance form existed in 1960 until I got dumped into the middle of it, and then it became pretty much a crusade, more because I wanted to know for my own edification. And the reason that happened was because when I would ask, what does this mean? Why do you do this? Where is this from? Because I'm curious. It's like I want to know everything. I want to know where the feet grow from, as my mother would say. I was the kind of kid that would take apart an alarm clock, put it back together, and still have parts left over, and it would work.
Yep, I've actually been there, literally.
Yeah. In fact, when I was like 7 years old, I campaigned for a chemistry set for my birthday. It was one of those sets where you get the chemicals in little bottles with a little cork in it. And they had this one experiment where you mixed a little of this and a little of that, and you hit it with a hammer, and you got a loud bang like you get with a cap gun, because it was gunpowder. So I figured if I could get a loud bang like that, what would happen if I took the whole bottle of this and the whole bottle of that and hit it with a hammer, and I put it in my mother's sink, which had a big porcelain sink. And I hit it with a hammer, and I blew up the sink. And she was so afraid the landlord would throw us out of the apartment because I blew up the sink. But when he found out what happened, he thought it was the funniest thing going. He just made me promise not to put anything in the sink again. That's the kind of a kid I was. So I wanted to know. So I'd ask the grannies and the aunties and the grandpas and the uncles, what does this mean? What does that mean? Why do you do it this way and not that way? Why do you do it that way and not this way? And each one of them had a different story. I wanted to know what was the real story. I mean, if this one is saying this and that one is saying that, where is the truth? What is the real story? And that's why I started traveling over there, or one of the reasons why. The main thing that got me going was I saw a little bit of Gidra, and I needed to see more. So I started going to Morocco first for that. But I wanted to know because, as I said, one person told me this, another person told me that, and there were so many different stories. I thought that I was like being lied to or being told a fairy tale, and I wanted to find out for myself, what was the truth. So I start going over to see the real things in the real places, and I find out that everybody was telling me the truth, that there was no one answer. There were lots of different reasons and lots of different dances. It wasn't just one homogeneous entity. And that was fascinating. And the thing that distresses me is in the last 30 years, there's been more loss and erosion of a lot of these traditional forms than in the prior 2,000 years because of things like iTunes, the iPods, Internet, DVDs, things like that, where media are so easily and widely dispersed because of like television, places that don't have electricity. You can still run a VCR or a television on a car battery that you operate by pedaling a bicycle to keep the juice going in it. And it has homogenized so much of the folklore in ways that were not possible before this technology. And that distresses me because it's the variety and the creativity that, to me, was the most fascinating and what I really loved so much about all of this. You know, now it's gotten, in my opinion, a little bit too MTV sounding.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm still here.
Yeah, that's one of the traps of technology, right? You know, you have the ability to talk to so many more people. So, like right now, we're doing this. But at the same time, some channels and some voices get louder than others. And so kind of what gets publicized and what gets privileged doesn't necessarily represent the full richness that's out there. And so
yes.
I guess that's the challenge for my generation and the next ones is to figure out how to.
Exactly. Hello?
Oh, sorry about that. I muted myself by accident.
Oh, okay. I thought like maybe the battery on this phone went.
Yeah. Anyway, thinking about happier things.
Yes.
So, you know, how did the shows that you were doing in those days compare to what we're doing now?
Good question. There's a lot more variety now, mostly with stuff that we invented. Even though what we call fusion now existed then, it's just that it was Americans making it up as they went along kind of thing rather than a conscious fusing of forms. It was because they didn't have the knowledge to do the quote-unquote real stuff. So they made it up as they went along. There's a lot more variety now where that's concerned. And as I said, there's a higher median level of skill now than we had then because of classes, because people being serious about it and wanting to do it right and studying and practicing and doing the best they can at something rather than there were a lot more people in those quote-unquote early days that were doing it because it was in that time and environment, it was easy money. It isn't anymore. As I said, that first oil embargo totally turned the economy in a way, and a lot of those wonderful mom-and-pop places closed because if people didn't have the means to get to work, they weren't going to be using precious gas to get to a restaurant, especially a Middle Eastern restaurant, when they were under the misimpression that it was the Middle Easterners that were raising the price on the oil rather than the good old American oil companies gouging their customers. Hello?
Yep. And so, you know, another thing that I'm wondering is, you know, when you started going over there,
yeah,
I know that you saw both, you know, dance performances and also some more, you know, socially oriented dance. How did their shows at that time over there compared to the shows that you saw in New York around the same time? Because I remember when I was trying to wrap my head around, you know, how the dance has changed, there's how it's changed over time and how it's changed in different places. And so, there's a huge landscape to understand, both in time and place.
Well, when I started going, I went to Morocco the first time in '63, and that was to Gulmim, which is on the edge of the desert, to learn Gidra, which is a trance ritual. It's not a dance. It's a trance ritual of the Kilt Hagelmus, the Tuareg. And then I went to Egypt the first time in '64. There weren't the costume changes then that there are now. There weren't the humongous bands where name dancers were competing by who could have the bigger orchestra or the most percussionists. See how many they can fit on a stage at once. The shows were, I wouldn't say simpler, but I would say less packaged. There weren't as many costume changes in like the way they do now. It was the technique was as good as it is now. It's more the orchestration and amplification, the fact that the shows have gotten, or they had gotten up until '93. Now you don't see what I saw in the '70s and the '80s when I was bringing groups over there, and I could take them in 2 weeks to see a different name dancer every night, and the performing companies were performing. The economy there and the dancing there has pretty much been in the toilet since the middle of 1993. And there are several reasons for that. So that the dancing that I was able to show my duckies that came on the tours with me are impossible to find now. And that is a crying shame. And then, of course, we now have all the political upheaval that's going on, and that's not going to calm overnight.
Right.
But the dance scene there is, well, when I started bringing groups, the dinner shows on the dinner cruise boats, where it's like a 2 to 3 hour cruise with dinner and a show, the beginner dancers work those. The beginner dancers. Now, name dancers are fighting for 1 or 2 nights on a dinner cruise. That's how bad the situation has gotten there.
Gotcha.
It's pretty damn awful. And it's a crying shame.
So, speaking of change, you've got 53 years in the industry. What changes have you seen in the dance over that time? Or in the dance scene, even?
You got a year?
I do. I don't know if everybody else does.
My God, there's so much. I mean, first of all, the fact that it has gone semi-mainstream, which never would have occurred at the time. In fact, early on when I first started performing and when I first started doing seminars, there were places where the Citizens Committee Against Pornography was about to come out and picket the performance venue for one of my seminars in Springfield, Missouri, which was notorious for having more churches per capita than any other place in the United States of America. and the Citizens Committee Against Pornography was going to run me out of town on a handrail because they weren't going to have any belly dancing Jezebel corrupting the youth of their city. And so I said, you good Christian folks, right? You read your Bible, right? Oh, yes, we read our Bible every day. I said, good. Sit down. I'm about to give you chapter and verse. And I went through every point in the Bible where they say so-and-so danced for joy, or they brought out the timbrels and the thises and the thats, and they danced. And I said, if it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for you. And they came to the show because they were thrilled and shocked that this Jezebel could quote Bible to them. That doesn't happen anymore, as there are a lot more people who know about it. But there are still a lot of people who don't know what it is and have this mistaken fantasy as to what they would like to think it is, and it isn't. Mm-hmm. So there's still that, but it's improved considerably. I brought Middle Eastern dance into venues that had never had it before, that wouldn't have been caught dead having it anywhere, but because of the quality of the shows or the reviews that I got, or the people in some of those places that were willing to put their jobs on the line to stand up for the dance. I was able to get it into museums and schools and lots of places it had never been, quote-unquote, allowed before. Mm-hmm. I was first in a lot of places. One of the things that helped where that was concerned was I've got this ludicrous IQ. And when I was doing a Broadway show, at one point, they were doing a lot of promotion, a lot of publicity over the fact that she's got this IQ and she's a what? You know, kind of thing. And it brought people out to the shows, but at one point, these two women challenged me and said, oh, you think you're so smart. Have you ever heard of an organization called Mensa? No, which I hadn't. Well, it's this organization where you need an IQ over whatever, and blah, 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 and you take this test and yap, 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 and we are willing to bet you $150 each, and at that point that was a lot of money. We don't think you could pass that test. And it was like, bring it on, I need a new winter coat. I took the exam, and of course I passed, and they had to pay off the bet, and I bought a fur-lined coat that I wore for like 6 years. It kept me nicely warm all winter. Thank you very much, ladies. I really appreciate the fact that you have a gambling habit. And because of a lot of the publicity, and Mensa saw that they had a good thing here where they could get a lot of publicity over the fact that I was a member. So they did. And in a lot of instances where they wouldn't have had a quote-unquote belly dancer anywhere on their premises before, because I was a member of Mensa, all of a sudden it was possible that I might not run screaming through the room, ripping my clothes off and molesting children. So they hired me. And when they also found out that I could actually stand up and dance, they were pretty happy about it. And a lot of other jobs came through as a result. So this was a good thing, and there are a lot of places now where you can see Oriental dance well presented and well performed where you wouldn't have seen it before. So we're in a lot of venues now that we wouldn't have been in before that. And so there's work in areas that we didn't have work in before. But there are still places where if you say you do Oriental dance, I say, oh, you mean belly dance? I mean Oriental dance. But I still get the phone slammed in my ear because of the misnomer and the connotation that it carries from the time that it was coined. People forget that a lot of things have to do with context. And in the mid-1890s, it was the height of the Victorian era. You didn't mention parts of the body out loud in polite conversation. You didn't even say arm or leg. You said limb.
And pianos had to wear skirts.
Yeah, and chairs and tables, too. Like they had these long ruffles on them because you didn't want to see the tables and chairs had legs, because if you saw the tables and chairs had legs, you might remember that people have legs, and people could use those legs to walk toward each other and maybe do nasty things. Oops. And so you said limb, and when you sat down to eat a chicken dinner, when you were munching on a dead cooked bird, you didn't ask for leg meat or thigh meat. You asked for drumstick or dark meat. You didn't dare ask for breast meat. If you couldn't ask for leg meat or thigh meat, you couldn't certainly not ask for breast meat. Oh, my God, that was obscene of obscene of obscene. So you asked for light meat and dark meat, and that's where that came from. So the time and the connotation that those words had within that time very much colored what people thought of the dance and the people who did it, which is why the misnomer carries such weight even today. I'm shocked that it still carries that kind of weight nowadays. It's ludicrous. I mean, they should get over themselves already, you know?
And, looking at over the same time period, there's the old saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah.
So what hasn't changed?
Good question. A lot of the music that we use is still very close to what it was then. What we think is the traditional costume is kind of close to what it was then. The fact that it's still considered kind of exotic and a little bit naughty is close to what it was then. Good question. I never actually thought about that much. So I'd have to think about it more.
Mm-hmm. And, out of curiosity, when I started dancing in 2000,
yeah.
I got dropped into the middle of this huge community. I mean, there were hundreds of students in Boston at the time, and there are probably more now. And obviously that's not what it was like in the 60s. So how has the dance community dynamic changed?
Well, we have ways of communicating that didn't exist then. We've got the Internet. We've got chat lists. When I started in this biz, in fact, my first article was published in a medical magazine because there were no Middle Eastern dance publications. We had tons of them at one point, and now we've got e-zines and chat groups up the yin-yang. It's fabulous. We have much more communication and much more sharing of knowledge and much more sharing of individual creativity than we were able to have then. And we also have seminars which didn't exist till Paul Monti invented them in 72, 73 and put his money where his mouth was. And we've got the shows that go with it and dance companies and doing concerts that didn't exist. I was one of the first to do a concert. There were people in California that were doing like little concerts here and there. And I lectured at the Museum of Natural History for over 20 years until the person who had the courage to first hire me, and he had to put his job on the line to do it, he retired, and the person who took his place decided she wasn't going to use any of the people he used, no matter how much we knew. So but it was a nice 20-year run in the Museum of Natural History, where they wouldn't have dreamed in their nightmares, not in their dreams, in their nightmares, of hiring a quote-unquote belly dancer. So we've got all kinds of venues and communication possibilities and sharing possibilities that simply did not exist 53 years ago. 53 years ago, there were two kinds of venues. There were the ethnic clubs, and in the ethnic clubs, there were the family clubs, and then there were the Playboy-type clubs, not like Playboy as in Hugh Hefner Playboy, but where guys went to look for girls. There were those venues, too. But the people who really, knew how to dance or cared about their dancing didn't work those venues. Then there were the American venues where it was all hoochie cooch with the Sultan Act, where you had to, because we didn't have CDs and iPods and DVDs, we had to haul our tails around to have a Nagila, Mizzaloo, and Fiddler on the Roof. So I avoided those places like the plague for the first 8-9 years I was in the business. Now we can haul the music we want with us on an iPod. My underwear weighs more than an iPod. It didn't exist. Now it does. So things have changed very much because of technology and communications that didn't exist back then.
And, if you look back over what the dance has been at different points in your career, and then you look forward towards the next generations of dancers, what do you think are the most important things to carry forward? What do you want to make sure that they keep alive?
The real dance. Like, you can go in all the directions with all the creativity you want, but you still need to know where the roots are and respect that and keep it going. You can't bring it forward without knowing where it came from. And I'm kind of afraid that enough attention isn't paid to that because of the desire to be different and to do something new or different just because you can be different. And that doesn't necessarily mean better, because different isn't always better.
Mm-hmm. And, I know a topic that's really close to your heart is truth in labeling.
Yeah.
And it seems like that gets more important as the dance landscape changes. Even in my time, I've seen completely new fusion genres spring into being, and they're creative and they're awesome.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it also seems like when things get more complicated, it almost gets harder to label properly. So what's your advice to dancers on that?
I don't know. It's like what I also remark on in my book is that we're always looking for labels even where they're not necessary. We're looking to call something a style when it's not necessarily a style. And why do we have to call it a style? Why this need to have a label for something that might not necessarily need it?
So, one thing that I think happens a lot is that those of us who worry about being respectful and worry about being conscientious, and I don't mean just people who think it's important, but people who actually worry about it. Am I doing the right thing? Am I researching this hard enough? Is this okay? Right? I think sometimes we look for the people who are labeling things because then it feels like they know what's right.
Yes.
And sometimes they are, and sometimes they're mistaken, and sometimes they're completely wrong, and they're just hiding the fact that they don't know it either, and it's really tough. So
it is, and I'm not afraid to say I don't know when I don't know, because I sure as hell don't know everything, that's for sure. I don't know anywhere near as much as I'd like to.
Mm-hmm.
But that's real life.
Yeah. But then again, I guess that's also not the cost, but, what we have to deal with for being part of such a rich community and having such a varied and deeply rooted dance that there's just so much.
Yeah.
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 And that's what being a geek is about, right?
Yes.
If it was simple, we'd lose interest.
Mm-hmm. You know what? That is totally true. One of the reasons I love the dance so much is I sailed through school. If it was written, I could read it, I could learn it, I could assimilate it. It's kind of like the show Suits where he says, if I read it, I remember it, I understand it, and then it's mine. Learning how to dance was the hardest thing I ever did in my life because I had 3 left feet. If it weren't so hard, I wouldn't have stayed. And what surprised me was how totally complex and total other technique Oriental dance was from other dance forms that I knew. Because I was a pretty damn good, what passed for ballroom dance in the 50s. I was pretty good at that because that's what we did socially, and I liked it. But learning flamenco and then learning shari were the hardest things I ever did. If it were easy, I would have left it after a couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm still learning, and it ain't easy, but it sure is fun.
Uh-huh. That is such a good note. I think I'm going to put an end to the interview there. Now, I do have a couple of follow-up questions for you, but before we do that, I want to just let folks know we are about to start the question and answer section. So I am going to ask a couple more questions, but in the meantime, if you're on the webcast and you have a question, you can start typing that in the box at left, and I'll go through those. If you're on the phone or on Skype, you can press *2 to raise your hand, and then I can unmute you so you can ask your question. Now, if you are on Skype, that's *2 on your Skype keypad, not *2 on your keyboard. Okay, so go ahead and type in your questions, raise your hands, and in the meantime, so Aunt Rocky, if listeners take away one thing from this call, what would you want that to be?
Wow. You had mentioned this before, and I thought that was pretty hard, and I still think it's pretty hard. The one thing is, if you're going to do it with love. Do it with passion. It is such fun. Folks, this is a folk dance. This is a folk dance of a large part of the world. And the reason that folks do folk dances is for fun. It's supposed to be fun, and it is fun. So let it be fun.
Mm-hmm. All right. So this has been really cool. We've been at this for 90 minutes, and I could go for another hour, but obviously we can't. But obviously there's a lot more that people can learn from you. So if people do want more Aunt Rocky, how can they get it?
Well, I've got a book out, as you mentioned, and they can go to my website, which is www.casbadance.org. That's orgy without a Y. And there's a let me see what it looks like. Wait a minute, I got my computer on. I don't often look at it up there. What does it say? It says shop up at the top. And a shop, you'll find the book, and you can get it there. It weighs a ton. If you don't like what I wrote in it, you can use it for a doorstop. Makes a really good doorstop. And it's 424 pages. And where it's my theory, what I think something is, I say so. Mm-hmm. If it's and I tell you why I think it is, why I think it is. I will always give a reason. And actually, after I wrote the book and it was out, and it's mostly based on questions I was answering over and over and over and over again on the Middle Eastern Dance chat list that was run by Eileen Bauer, that was moderated by Eileen Bauer for many years, which was a fabulous, fabulous chat list. And that was what made me Aunt Rocky, was that chat list. And I noticed that there'd be the same questions asked over and over with increasing frequency. When people would write in, the new people would have the same questions. So I started archiving my posts so that I could more easily answer the question the next time it came in, because I'm a lousy typist. When I was in high school, I deliberately didn't learn how to type well because I didn't want to be pushed into being a secretary, which was where they pushed most young women in that era. And so I didn't learn how to type. And as I said, God's got a real weird sense of humor. Go know I'd be on the internet typing 24/7 because that's what happened. And I wasn't good at typing, so I didn't want to have to retype things over and over and over and over again. So I just archived the posts, and I would do Control-C, Control-V. I copied it and pasted it. And I saved those posts, and so I went through a lot of them. And when I decided I was going to put it in a book, it was because people were twisting my arm and telling me if I didn't put it in a book, they were never going to talk to me again. So I put it in a book. And then no sooner is the book out, where there were two questions, where one I said I'd never heard of something. I didn't know if it was this or that or the other, but I hadn't heard about it, so I couldn't say. I find out what the answer is. So now, with every book that I send out a little sheet that is the additional information that I was able to get from somebody after the book was out. So it's an update, and also another book that I read after that I thought was a really good book for people to have and to read.
Nice. I didn't get that, and now I'm jealous, but I got the first edition, so yeah. Now, one thing I want to say about the book, and this is something that I really like because, I have a full-time day job and I dance full-time. So all this, seminar stuff and the stuff I'm working on is literally 40 hours a week, every week or more. Wow. And so I have no time, right? And so it's this huge book, and I got it and I thought, oh my God, I'm so excited, but when am I going to read this thing? And you can open up the first page and then read the first page and the second page and work your way to the end. But you can also literally pick it up, open to any page, and get a tidbit that's going to make sense on its own. So you can just, read the pieces that you're interested in. And it's a nice index, too. So you can jump in and, read just about the piece that you're interested in at the moment. And so that, I think, makes it really accessible, even though there's so much good stuff in it.
Thank you.
My pleasure. And, I understand that you have a special just for Clubhouse listeners. Can you tell us about that?
If you order it before Valentine's Day, February 14th, if you order it and pay for it before then with PayPal, I'll pay for the postage. So what you've got to do is send me an email stating and go on to PayPal, and you make the payment to Morocco at kasbadance.org rather than going through my website. And you get the book, and you don't put in the money, the $5 for the postage. So there's $5 off there. I will pay the postage.
Okay, so you use the send money feature inside of PayPal instead of clicking on your website.
Yeah.
And if anybody has any trouble with that, can they email you?
Oh, God, yes, sure. And I download, I'm here, so I've got my computer on most of the day. But when I'm traveling, I download at least twice a day, so I'm always.
And that was Morocco at kasbadance.org. Excellent. And it's a big book, so shipping is not exactly cheap. So thank you for offering that. That's a nice plus.
Pleasure. I send it by media mail, so it's much cheaper that way, and it also gets there quicker. the things you learn.
So we've got some hands raised, so I'm going to let the first person on the line. So this is a caller from area code 301. You are unmuted. Hi there.
Hi.
Hi, this is Ayan Serene, and it's a pleasure to talk with you again, Aunt Rocky.
Thank you.
I actually visited you last spring.
I remember.
Yeah, and Nadira already asked one of my questions, which was what was one of the things that we as dancers can do in order to continue the authentic tradition of belly dance, and you said keep the real dance. Mm-hmm. Something else is kind of creeping up around in my area that's been really hard for me to swallow, and that's that I've noticed the creeping in of burlesque into the belly dance scene. And first of all, I'd like to know if there is any kind of history related to that back in your day, or is this something new?
Well, there was a time in America where the only place you could see Oriental dance, or what was being presented as Oriental dance, was in the burlesque houses, because it almost as soon as a show would pop up somewhere, it would be shut down by the authorities.
Oh. Because
of prejudice, racism, all those wonderful little things that we have such a great tradition of. And so the only place you could see anything that was calling itself, quote unquote, belly dance, was in those sorts of venues.
Okay.
So yes, it did exist there, but that doesn't mean it was the real stuff in any way, shape, or form.
Okay. Okay. Is it something, a tradition that you think we should continue? Because I really have a hard time thinking.
That depends on what people consider burlesque.
Okay.
You know, because in some instances what it was political satire and comedy. And in other instances it was a bunch of sleaze. And so if something is a bunch of sleaze, I'm not interested. But if it is an accurate rendition of it, then I'm fine with it. There was a time when there were strippers who were fabulous dancers. They were artists, but it was the only place that a lot of dancers could become employed, because there weren't really continually working ballet companies till Lincoln Kirsten started bankrolling George Balanchine, and there wasn't even really a tradition of ballet in general, or dance as a profession, or ballet being respected until the exigencies of the Cold War and the fact that the Soviets were giving medals for ballet, so we had to beat them at their own game type of thing.
Okay.
It's amazing where politics raises its ugly head.
Okay. All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Personally, though, if they're going to, if they're going to do an Oriental dance show, I prefer to see a good dance, thank you. And not, not raunch and sleaze.
Okay.
That was a great question. Thank you. Okay, we've got a couple more hands raised, and if anybody else does want to raise your hand, it's star 2. But let me hop over to the webcast.
Yeah.
Now, over there, we've got 2 questions about costuming. So Ruby and Valdez, that's one of my friends in Alaska, who says, "Hey, Auntie, you mentioned the costume hasn't changed much. Where did the costume originate in New York City?"
Okay, my opinion, and what I've seen, from what I've seen historically and in photos and legitimate postcards versus the quote-unquote French postcards, There was a woman named Maud Allen who was quite the adventuress, and she had a vaudeville act where she played the part of Salome with the head of John the Baptist. Now, in that era, that was the shocker of shockers. But it was extremely successful, and there were an awful lot of people who decided to imitate her, because as you know, whenever anything is successful, people imitate it. And you get good imitators, you get bad imitators, you get all grades of imitation from really good to really gross. If you look at the pictures of her costume, you'll see it's very similar to what we think of as the bedla. Because there was no such thing as an uplift bra until Howard Hughes invented one for Jane Russell in the movie The Outlaw. You had to keep those puppies up there. And so that, this whole thing was part of the fantasy, and the bare midriff is thought to be kind of a vestige of the British Raj in India, the fascination with that bit of brown skin between the choli and the top of the sari. And European, mostly men, coming to the East with their Orientalist, in the Edward Said sense of the term Orientalist, fantasies of harem girls dancing for them. When that couldn't be further from the truth. But if you're paying for a full-service professional, as we say euphemistically, if you pay them enough and you want them to hang from a rafter, twirling flaming batons and singing Dixie, that's what you're going to get, because the job description is give the customer what they want. So they were going to see these fantasies, and they were being supplied by the people who were poor enough that they were desperate for the money and were supplying those fantasies. The split skirt is thought to have come from burlesque. The beaded belt and bra, they weren't necessarily beaded early on, but if you look at the early costumes, you'll see very much what we would call a basic Ghawazi outfit, a long skirt with a belt over it with ribbons that had tassels on the end of the ribbon. It wasn't a full tassel belt that was usually what was used to adorn a horse or a mule or a camel, and not as worn as a dance costume over there, quote unquote. But I think that a lot of it is based on the Maud Allen Salome. That's my personal opinion from what I've seen of costuming, that may have been a starting point. And then you had movies with people like Theda Bara in them, whose name was supposed to be an anagram for Arab death, or the femme fatale, the Rudolph Valentino movies, and that whole fascination with things of the Middle and Near East. So I think that it's a combination of factors that led to that, and also Hollywood kind of promoting that type of thing, and then the movies over there imitating the Hollywood movies and picking up on it, because if that's what sells, because before that, most of the name dancers wore what we would call a belly dress, except that it had flare skirts and not the straight skirts, with a sash at the hips. They weren't running around in bras and belts with their abdomens exposed. Hello? Am I still on? Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that I thought was one of the funnier comments in the book is that, in the climates that we're talking about, that is probably the stupidest thing you could possibly wear.
Oh, well, yeah, because there's an awful lot of made-up fantasy that when it's repeated often enough, people assume it's fact. Let's say, and one show that I saw in the Northwest at one point, the introduction was that in this little Arab town in the desert, The women are so heavily veiled that they can't talk to each other, but when they pass each other in the street to say hello, they shake their coin bras at each other. And I'm like, what? Okay, once upon a time there were 7 dwarves, and the first one's name was Horny. First of all, they didn't wear coin bras. As I said, where it hits 135 degrees in the shade, and it does in Abu Simbel, you're not going to wear metal next to bare skin. You'll be branding yourself daily. That stuff heats up, and it hurts. And, by the way, you can talk to each other through a veil, or you can lift it up and talk. Just like you can put a dinner napkin over your face and still talk through it, and you'll be understood. They're not shaking their boobs at each other. We're the country that's boob batty.
Okay. Well, let's go back to the live callers. So we've got a caller in area code 203.
Oh,
I have just unmuted you. Hi there.
Hi. I had the pleasure of meeting Morocco and seeing her dance, and I have her book. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Question.
Yeah.
I often wondered, have you performed for any of the royal families in the Middle East, and because you're so famous about their folk dancing and all that, and also, what is your particular favorite costume that you have had for yourself, and what was the best performance in your whole life that you ever did?
Well, there's a whole bunch of questions there that I can't answer because there are no answers. First of all, which royal family and which country? I've never danced for the current Jordanian royal family. Mm-hmm. I was very good friends with a fellow who turned out to be the cousin of King Hassan II, and on more than one occasion I performed there. But that and my little old lady discount card for the subway gets me on the subway at half price. I do regularly teach and lecture in Cairo, mostly for Rakia Hassan, Zahlan wa Sahlan, because the Egyptian Ministry of Culture was very impressed with a lecture I gave on dances, community identity, and selected Berber nations of Morocco, and I did a gidra at a big UNESCO conference in Cairo in, I think it was 1999 or 2000, and it was held at the new convention center in conjunction with the university from Minya. And I gave my paper that you see most of in the book on dances, community identity, and did Gidra, and I taught classes in Gidra and Shikhat and Shari, and Shireen Al-Safi was there too, and Dr. Barbara Sellers-Young. It was a really good panel. And they were freaked by the fact that I'm not Middle Eastern because I really knew my subject. So they pretty much suggested that she hire me to lecture and then to teach classes, which she did. So that's done very well, and that's why I'm teaching there. And I've also taught in Istanbul for various people, mostly for Tayyar Akdeniz, who is a sweetie pie. And I've taught in Morocco for real people. And I've performed there. And my favorite costume is hard to say. It changes. My current favorite costume is between the turquoise one that I'm wearing in the book and the black and gold one that's on the cover at the moment. But I also have a couple of others that are bedlas that I still think are great. And I can't say which is my all-time favorite show because that keeps changing. I wish I could give you a more finite answer, but I can't.
Your name, Aunt Rocky. How in heaven's name did you ever get that?
Oh, that's a story. Sit down. Get yourself a cup of tea.
I'm all ears.
Okay. I was on the Med List, and actually I had first found out about the Med List because one of my former students who lived in California had told me they were having this big discussion on a chat list on, this was like I ran into her at Mikasa. They were having this big discussion about something about me on this chat list, and somebody had said something and they didn't like what she said and they were flaming her, and I said, what do you mean flaming her? So her boyfriend downloaded a copy of the discussion that was going on, and I read it, and it was like this woman wanted and had a very valid question, and they were yelling at her online for having this valid question, and I wanted to get on this list so I could answer her question and tell them to stop yelling at her. And I had never been on a chat list or gone online before, so I was afraid to, because I didn't grow up with the technology, and I'm kind of like a little nervous around it, even though I love it. And so I was recovering from a minor operation, and I was on painkillers, and some friends took me out for dinner, and we had some wine, and I was thoroughly soused. I mean, I was stoned, I was drunk, I was feeling no pain, and I get back home and say to my friends, I'm going to download the CompuServe discs and see if I can get on this chat list. So I download the discs, and I say, okay, how do I get online here? How do I go to this? And they said, you're on it, because it was live at that point. And so I'm typing away, and I'm having a grand old time. And it was obvious from my context and my syntax that I was looped. So they called me. They said, hey, the commissioner's on. And they called me the High Commissioner, because I was. And at that point, there was a TV show about a huggy bear of a police commissioner in upstate New York. It was called Commish. So I was signing my posts Commish because I thought everyone was in on the joke, because it was short for High Commissioner. And then there was this one guy who was always trying to veer the discussion toward things political, when this was a dance chat list. And yes, politics are important, and yes, you need to know the politics of where you're going so you know if you're going to come back home or not. But he was being really obnoxious, and people were ignoring him. And then one day I get this long, nasty email directly from him asking me, who the hell do I think I am, setting myself up as the authority, as the commissioner. And I realized he didn't know. I mean, the guy was an asshole, pardon my French, but he didn't know how that whole thing came about, and that it was a big joke, that I wasn't setting myself up as commissioner. But if he thought that, twit though he was, maybe other people thought that too, and that was really arrogant, and that's not who I am. So I thought, also, if people think I'm setting myself up as a commissioner, it would sound like I was giving commands rather than sharing information. So I thought, well, who do you listen to more? You certainly don't listen to your parents, because they're your parents. Who do you listen to? You listen to your favorite aunt or your favorite uncle. And my nephews call me Aunt Rocky. So I started signing things Aunt Rocky, and it actually, in a way, worked, because it made it friendlier and more approachable, which is what I wanted. And that's the story. That's the total truth. And the thing is, that chat list was at that point the only chat list dealing with Middle Eastern dance on the net at the time. And in a way, I think it was the best one, because it stuck to the subject, and it wasn't as complex. It was pretty direct, and it was there, and it was, not fancy graphics, just straight ahead print. And you could either get it as a digest or get the individual posts. And I found that it was better to get it as a digest, because when I got the individual posts, I tended to overreact and spend my whole time online. But Eileen lost her job, and was in the course of trying to get another job. The list pretty much died out, unfortunately. But now we have lots of other forums. The problem is we have lots of other forums, and it's hard to be in 18 places at once.
Mm-hmm. Very, very interesting, and your stories are very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Those were great. All right, so we are almost at 2 hours, believe it or not. So we're going to take one more call.
Okay.
We've got a caller in area code 607. Hi there.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Wow, I'm Rocky.
Yeah.
This is Sayini Morningstar from back in the day when we were the Rocky Horror Show.
Oh, my God. How are you?
Girlfriend, how are you?
Still breathing.
You are too fabulous and
Thank
too
you.
authentic. I'm listening to you, and it's so delicious, and I thank your hostess so much for this wonderful, wonderful conference and forum. You are consummate teacher, instructor, educator,
Thank you.
preserver of culture, baby doll, you got it all. You have it all, and a master dancer. Master.
Thank you, sweetheart.
I was so fortunate to be in your care back in the day, and I'm still moving, Rocky. I can still move this stuff.
Oh, honey, you
Girl?
can't keep us down, girlfriend.
When you put it there, you put it there. I'm way up in the Finger Lakes, Ithaca, and I've lived up in this area for quite a while in Corning, New York. Doing my artwork thing, Rochester, and so on. And whenever I go and try to take a class with someone, there's a whole lot of stuff going on because when I hit the floor, I'm looking like the Rocky Horror Show, and it is so intimidating.
Right. Right. Don't let it intimidate you.
I'm old as dirt.
Oh, honey, I'm going to be 74. Get over it.
You're kidding me.
No, I'm not. I'm born March 2nd, 1940.
All right. I'm 1944, so I have 70 coming up in May. And I just wanted to... Oh, yeah. I'm loving it. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for what you gave us. The gift of dance is one of the greatest healers of my life. And like you, the most difficult thing for me was to dance, even though my spirit, it's down in the bone marrow. Mm-hmm. But someone had to help bring it to the fore. And because of you and my African dance teachers, I am still moving the stuff.
I'm so glad.
I have a little poem that I keep on my wall, and it says, I get up, I walk, I fall down. Meanwhile, I keep dancing.
Yes.
Rocky, if you're coming to this area, Ithaca, Cornell area, at any time, you know how to reach me, the usual email stuff. I would love to be in your presence.
Thank you.
And how blessed we are that the good sister tonight has presented you in this wonderful conference.
It's a total pleasure, and she is a delight to work with. I've never met anybody who was just more organized and logical in going about this. It's been an absolute pleasure from day one.
Oh, yeah, you know how good it is to our hostess, how good it is? You let Rocky loose tonight.
Oh, you're going to keep me in a cage? I don't think so.
You loosed her on us, and this is so wonderful because her authenticity cannot be barred or fenced in any way. So I truly appreciate your stories are just over the top wonderful, and as you know me, a professional storyteller. I collect the stories. This is one that I'm collecting tonight that will be told, God knows, 1,000 years from now when I'm in one of the other worlds. I'll be telling this one.
Thank you, sweetheart.
I love you.
I love you too, Sayini. Mwah!
Mwah! Double mwah. Now I'm going to go look at my pictures from Morocco.
Okay.
All right. Well, I think that is a lovely place to end. So thank you so much for calling in. And I think we are done. So thank you so much, Morocco.
Oh, my absolute pleasure, honey. And if you want to do more, just give me a scream, because this was easy.
Oh, we will
fun.
Talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure. And thank you, everybody, for coming.
Yes.
And this is the end of our call, but that doesn't mean the conversation has to end. So those of you who are listening live or on the recording, we've got a private Facebook group just for Clubhouse listeners. I'll include an email. Sure, I'll be sending out an email in a little while with the call recording, but that will also have an invitation to the Facebook group. So I'll include the call recording and a link to Aunt Rocky's book, as well as how you can reach her to get the special free shipping. And I'm also going to include a link to a survey because I'd really like your feedback. So, the Belly Dance Geek Clubhouse is mine in the sense that I run it, but it's really for all of us. I don't do this just to sit here and talk to people, although that is a really big plus when I can, sit on the phone and talk to Morocco for 2 hours. It's also for all of you. So I'd really like to hear what topics and speakers you'd like to hear here on the Clubhouse, and also any way that I can improve it for you. And also our next call is going to be on Monday, February 17th, and that's going to be at 3 p.m. Eastern Time because it's President's Day. So I'm off work, and hopefully many of you are too. So the 3 p.m. slot also lets us accommodate some of our European listeners and also any really serious morning people down under, whereas the usual 8 o'clock Eastern Time rules a lot of people out.
Well, actually, my European friends, I told them that they could, log on to your website and hear it after the fact, that it'll be up there.
Absolutely. But the earlier slot lets them call in so that they can ask questions too. That's a little bit nicer. But yeah, the downloads are always available. And, so long as I have a website, they'll be up. So that's always, downloading is always an option.
Wonderful.
So my February guest is going to be Agila out of Ohio, and she's going to be talking about the legacy of Mahmoud Reda. So if you know who he is, this is going to be exciting. And if you don't, you want to know. And finally, the Belly Dance Geek Clubhouse is the come-on-in kind of clubhouse, not the no boys allowed kind. So if you know anybody who would like to join us, you can invite them to geek out with us at bellydancegeek.com/clubhouse. And until next time, happy dancing. Good night, everybody.
Good night, sweetheart.
Thanks for listening. For more geek-tacular resources, visit bellydancegeek.com.